The 2nd of March 1944, Central Germany. Administrative sector of a prisoner of war holding camp. The corridor outside the medical intake room smelled faintly of carbolic soap and damp wool. A single frosted window filtered the late winter light into a pale gray wash. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. The intake ledger lay open on a metal desk, its pages already filled with careful handwriting, dates, names, brief notations. This was routine work repeated hundreds of times across the German POW system on that morning. One female prisoner was processed under procedures originally designed for men. Her arrival did not disrupt the camp. There were no alarms, no arguments, no raised voices. What followed was quieter than that, a decision made on paper, in ink by camp medical staff who were not improvising, but attempting to apply existing rules to a situation those rules had never fully anticipated. This case did not stand out at the time. It would only become significant later, when historians began comparing records across multiple camps and noticed a pattern in how female prisoners were handled when their presence challenged standard policy. By 1944, the German POW system had processed millions of prisoners from across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Camp structures, labor assignments, medical intake protocols, and housing regulations were standardized through military administration manuals that assumed prisoners would be male combatants. Women captured during World War II fell into ambiguous categories. Some were auxiliary personnel. Others were medical workers, resistance affiliates, or individuals detained during broader security sweeps. When women entered POW systems, they often did so through administrative gaps rather than clearly defined policy pathways. Records suggest this was not rare, but it was inconsistently handled. In many camps, women were temporarily housed in transit compounds, medical wards, or repurposed administrative buildings while officials determined how to classify them. This created case-by-case solutions rather than universal rules. The prisoner processed on the 2nd of March 1944 was one such case. The medical intake process was procedural. Height, approximate weight, visible injuries, signs of infectious disease, all recorded quickly, efficiently, and without commentary. The prisoner's file did not include a personal narrative. It included numbers, dates, and observations. One notation, however, required attention. The woman was medically cleared for light labor, but her classification did not align with any existing labor category available for female prisoners within that camp structure. The labor detachments were designed for men. Medical exemptions were similarly structured around male physiology and occupational expectations. This created an administrative pause. Similar cases appear across multiple camps during the later years of the war, particularly as resource shortages intensified and administrative efficiency became more critical. Camp doctors and clerks were increasingly tasked with resolving classification problems locally rather than referring them upward through command channels. In this case, the intake staff recorded a recommendation rather than an assignment. That recommendation would alter the woman's experience of captivity. The decision was not dramatic. It did not involve defiance or protest. It involved reassignment. Instead of being placed in a standard labor detail or transferred to a general holding compound, the prisoner was reassigned to a restricted internal work category, one that limited physical strain, reduced exposure, and kept her within the medical sector of the camp. This category existed on paper, but it was rarely used. Archival records indicate that such internal classifications were often employed to manage prisoners who did not fit existing categories, those who were medically borderline, administratively inconvenient, or structurally incompatible with camp labor systems. In practical terms, this meant the woman remained near the medical block rather than being sent to external labor details. Before the decision, Her projected path mirrored that of thousands of other prisoners. Labor assignment, ration dependency, exposure to seasonal conditions, and minimal medical oversight. After the decision, her captivity followed a quieter trajectory. Standard POW life in 1944 was defined by predictability rather than cruelty in its daily mechanics. Prisoners were fed according to regulated rations, housed in overcrowded barracks, and assigned labor based on camp needs rather than individual capacity. Medical care existed, but it was reactive. Prisoners reported illness or injury after symptoms became unavoidable. Preventive care was minimal. For women placed into these systems, the mismatch was immediate. Clothing was ill-fitting. Sanitation arrangements were improvised. Privacy was almost non-existent. Medical logs from multiple camps note increased complications for female prisoners assigned to standard labor roles, particularly related to fatigue, nutritional stress, and untreated infections. These observations rarely resulted in policy changes, but they did inform local decisions. The woman processed on the 2nd of March, 1944 would likely have followed this path had her intake classification been finalized without revision. The reassignment did not grant comfort. It granted stability. Within the medical sector, work consisted of cleaning, record sorting, and basic logistical tasks. These roles did not carry special status, nor did they increase rations. They did, however, reduce exposure to harsh weather and heavy physical strain. This distinction mattered. Post-war analyses of POW mortality and morbidity rates indicate that small differences in labor intensity and shelter access significantly affected survival outcomes, especially during the final years of the war when supply lines deteriorated. This case reflects how POW policies were applied unevenly, not out of compassion, but out of administrative pragmatism. The camp staff did not act to protect the prisoner as an individual. They acted to resolve a classification problem efficiently. That efficiency had consequences. One of the most striking aspects of this case is how little commentary accompanies it. There is no marginal note expressing concern, no justification paragraph, no recorded debate. The reassignment appears in the ledger as a procedural adjustment, not an exception. This absence is important. Wartime documentation often reveals more through omission than explanation. When a decision leaves no narrative trace, it suggests it was considered unremarkable by those who made it. Historians have identified this pattern repeatedly. Women whose treatment diverged from standard practice recorded without emphasis, as if the system itself barely noticed the deviation. The woman's file ends the same way. Most POW files do, with transfer notations, ration entries, and eventually a release or relocation record. There is no summary of her experience. This case matters not because it was unique, but because it was representative. It demonstrates how wartime systems adapted quietly, without rewriting policy, when confronted with situations they were not designed to handle. The German POW system did not formally redefine women's roles within camps. Instead, it absorbed them through administrative adjustments that varied from camp to camp. Such variability shaped personal outcomes. Two prisoners captured under similar circumstances could experience entirely different forms of captivity, depending on local decisions made by clerks, doctors, or camp administrators. This case provides a rare, traceable example of how a single decision, unremarkable at the time, altered the trajectory of one prisoner's wartime experience. Wartime photographs from POW camps rarely focus on administrative spaces. When they do, they show desks, ledgers, and staff rather than prisoners themselves. In several surviving images from 1943 to 1944, women appear not in labor fields or barracks, but near medical or clerical buildings, often unnamed. often blurred into the background of larger scenes. These images do not document individual cases. They support patterns. They suggest that internal reassignment was not an anomaly, but a recurring solution. After the war, POW policies were examined primarily for violations and abuses. Administrative adaptations rarely drew attention unless they resulted in documented harm. As a result, cases like this remained largely unexamined until later historical work began, focusing on gendered experiences of captivity. Modern historians now recognize that female POW experiences cannot be understood solely through the lens of official regulations. They must be reconstructed from fragments, intake logs, labor rosters, medical notes, and the quiet decisions embedded within them. This case is one such fragment. This case tells us that life inside a POW camp was shaped as much by paperwork as by ideology. Policies define structures, but individuals, often unnamed and unremembered, lived within the spaces between those rules. A single administrative decision, made without drama or moral language, altered one woman's daily reality of war. Not because the system changed, but because, for a moment, it adjusted. And in wartime captivity, that difference mattered.